Hi class, welcome to lecture 7 part B. We're going to continue our lecture on interest group. This should be a rather short part B. I wanted to first address some of the maybe pros and cons of interest groups, or at least some of the criticisms and some of the good things people have to say about interest groups. Some say that interest groups, and we've already kind of talked a lot about the negatives, perhaps to talk about one or two of the positives. Some would argue that interest groups are necessary in a democratic system because it gives people a voice. Let me explain what I mean by that. Some would argue that interest groups promote what we would call pluralism. Pluralism meaning the idea that the American political process should be open to all, not just an elite few, and that the government should correspond with our public desires. So we could argue that interest groups promote it in the sense that as individuals that don't have billions of dollars, it might be hard to get your voice heard in government, right? You're just one person. And theoretically in a government, everyone's voice should somewhat count the same. But that's not always in actuality. So what interest groups allow us to do is use our resources together to get our voice heard. So to use an example, let's say I have a problem with my state government. I have this law that I really dislike. Again, as one man, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be able to have the resources to enact the change and at least to get the attention to make the change that needs to happen. But let's say I find 100 individuals that think the same way I do, and they find 100 more, and they find 100 more, and so on and so forth. Now all of a sudden we're maybe 2,000, 3,000 people strong. If we pool our resources together, we pool our money together and form an interest group, now all of a sudden our voice is more likely to be heard. Why? Because we have more money, so we can get more attention, get the attention of politicians. And two, we're now a larger part of that politician's constituency, I should say, meaning that that politician might be afraid if we don't have our voice heard, they might lose their re-election bid. Okay, so in that way, we can argue that interest groups allow people to come together, pool their resources, and actually enact change. We might also say the same about unions, right? We know that unions protect workers. California has very strong work unions, especially the longshoremen's union down at the docks. It allows those workers who otherwise might not have a voice to collectively add their resources, time, and skill together to lobby the government to create conditions more favorable to them. So in those ways, we might say there are some positives to interest groups. Let's see, we might also say that interest groups are beneficial in that they help legislatures with knowledge, right? So we'll oftentimes even see interest groups write bills, write policy, and give it to public officials because they have more expertise in that area. For example, let's say there's a farmers union, right? Believe it or not, California has a large agricultural sector, right? So a senator, it's somewhat ridiculous to expect a senator to know all the ins and outs of the farming business, the oil business, the longshoremen's union business. It's simply impossible that they have the area of knowledge that someone who's worked 30 years in that industry would have. So in forming interest groups and unions, the lawmakers can refer to them for expertise in writing legislation that's beneficial to them and perhaps for the entire state. So we could say that provided expertise is another benefit of interest groups. Let's move on now to some more criticism. And we've talked about this a little bit, the influence of money in politics. Some would say that interest groups overwhelmingly benefit wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals, sometimes or maybe even often at the expense of common people. Essentially, the criticism is money equals influence, which feeds into something called power elite theory. And that is the view that a small number of wealthy people essentially control the government. And I'm not talking like conspiracy, Illuminati, Colorado airport type stuff, right? I'm saying the more concrete idea that if you have wealth in this country, you can inordinately affect the way the government works. You'll have a much louder voice and much more control than the vast majority of the population. So think about whether you think that's true or not. I'm very curious to what you guys think. Another criticism, and one that I mentioned before, going back to the Amazon example, right? The line between lobbying and bribery is very much paper thin. You know, the end result is essentially the same. It's just the verbiage and the language and how you approach the situation is different. Throwing money on the table, demanding someone pass a law versus providing $1 million in fundraising money for the next campaign. Is there really a difference? Legally, yes. Morally, that's up for you to decide. Okay, so to to ask a couple questions here. I include these in the lectures for your own benefit, just to kind of get you to think about the material. Do you find interest groups to be good or bad, beneficial or detrimental? And depending on your answer for the first question, should interest groups be more tightly regulated? Some say they're nowhere near as regulated as they need to be. Some say that the existing regulation is fine. I'll leave that up for you to decide. So I provided you with a video here, and I'm going to make this mandatory because obviously I can't make you watch it, but I want you to watch this video because this is a video of a man named Jack Abramoff, who was one of the most prominent lobbyists in the country until he got caught basically for corruption and defrauding a certain corporation. The video goes into that, but he talks about the tricks and the money he would spend to influence politicians. You know, he talks about one point in this video spending $1 million, I believe, a year just on tickets to football games for politicians. Millions of dollars. I mean, it's really crazy. So please watch this video. And he's very honest and telling about it, but he's also somewhat untrustworthy. He seems, even today, he seems somewhat disingenuous. So watch it, but also watch it with a grain of salt because, you know, he is somewhat self-serving, it would seem. But please watch that video. It's very interesting. Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about is an actual example of an interest group, and that is the National Rifle Association, commonly known as the NRA, which I'm sure you have all heard of. Essentially, what the NRA does is, very successfully, I might add, is they oppose the regulation ban of all weapons and ammunition, essentially. They're very much pro-Second Amendment. They're very much against laws that seek to limit the regulation of any sort of firearm or any type of ammunition, magazine, etc. So the NRA is arguably the most successful interest group because they're very good at mobilizing support. They use a lot of different tactics. They use email blasts, social media very well. They pamphlets promoting information. They're very good at that. They're very good at getting the information out there. And more importantly, they're very good at mobilizing support. So they're good at getting people to show up and vote. Okay, so they'll throw out information there to their supporters, and they will go to the polls and vote based upon sometimes that single issue. And oftentimes they can publish on their website or on their newsletter, whatever it is, information about candidates that shows how gun friendly they have been in the past and how gun friendly they are likely to be in the future, et cetera. And there are a lot of people in this country who vote on single issues. And this is a very controversial issue that brings a lot of people to the polls. So the NRA is very, very successful at mobilizing support. And that's ultimately why they're perhaps the most successful interest group in existence. So here's a couple videos. These aren't necessarily mandatory, but they're very interesting. On the top, you can see a video put out by the NRA, and you can see kind of the strategies they use to get people to support them. And then on the bottom, you have a video that is obviously anti-NRA. So watch both if you have the time, and I'd be interested to see what you guys think. So when we're talking about the NRA, we do get some instances where, you know, every time there's a mass shooting, you hear on Twitter, on the news, you know, this isn't the NRA's fault. They're lobbying for looser gun laws. This tragedy wouldn't have happened if the NRA didn't exist. Others might argue that that blame is misplaced and perhaps emotional, because the NRA is simply an organization made up of individuals promoting an issue that they care about, right? These people who belong to the NRA or donate money to the NRA or are members of the NRA, they just want to protect their Second Amendment rights. They donate money to do that. Therefore, they are not really guilty of any violence that's on the actual perpetrator. So those are just two viewpoints. Again, I'm not saying either one of those is my viewpoint, but that tends to be the argument. So I'm curious to what you guys think. When we have mass shootings, which unfortunately seem to be occurring more and more often in this country, is the NRA at fault at all? Is the NRA lobbying for looser gun laws a part of the reason we see gun violence? Or is it more on the perpetrator? The NRA are simply promoting what they believe in. Is this criticism fair? And again, I'm also very curious what you guys think about that. Okay, so to close up the lecture, I want to talk about the iron triangle, okay? The iron triangle is a term used to define the relationship between three groups. And I'm going to ask for our midterm that you know the three groups that make up the 3 points of the iron triangle. And those are interest groups, bureaucracy, and Congress. Congress, bureaucracy, interest groups are the 3 points of the iron triangle. And it's said that a symbiotic relationship exists between these three entities. So what's a symbiotic relationship? You've probably heard the term before, but not in reference to politics, probably in reference to nature. So some animals have symbiotic relationships with each other. Let me think of a couple examples. So you have, with alligators, you have these little birds that will fly. I kid you not, this is real, look it up. These little birds they'll open their mouth, these little birds will fly in and pick out the food in between their teeth. How is this symbiotic? Well, it's mutually beneficial to both groups. Okay, so the bird gets to eat food and the crocodile gets clean teeth, so their teeth don't decay and fall out. That's symbiotic. Or those little sharks, or those little fish that swim on the sides of sharks, have you seen those? Those are in a symbiotic relationship. They get the scraps of whatever the shark eats, and in turn they keep the skin of the shark clean, I believe. Butterflies and flowers, same thing. There's a ton of nature examples. If you have any good ones, email me and tell me, because I'd love to have better examples for the class, but I'm sure there's a ton out there in nature. So essentially, we're calling this relationship between these three groups, again, interest groups, bureaucracy, and Congress, symbiotic, because they all rely on each other to get things done. And here's a pixely picture of what we're talking about. Congress relies on the bureaucracy. In turn, bureaucracy relies on Congress. Congress relies on interest groups. Interest group relies on Congress. Interest group, bureaucracy, same relationship. So all rely on each other to navigate the political system and get things done. Congress relies on the bureaucracy for funding, political support. We'll talk more about what bureaucracy is later. Bureaucracies are essentially the entity of government that implement laws. Okay. In turn, the bureaucracy relies on Congress for execution of laws that help the bureaucracy. Interest groups help Congress by giving electoral support, right? Money and funds to get elected. And in turn, Congress passes laws that allow interest groups to exist. Going between the interest groups and bureaucracies, same thing. Interest groups help bureaucracies by getting favorable laws passed, and bureaucracies support interest groups much in the same way, with lower regulation. Okay, so again, these are a symbiotic relationship. They all exist and they all help each other exist. It keeps going around like a circle. Okay, last thing, I promise. California is not immune to interest groups either. I want to talk just very briefly about that, because this again is a class about both the federal government and the state of California. So much like the federal government, a lot of money is spent in Sacramento to influence the government. It's around $300 million a year, which is crazy, right? I mean, different than $3 billion, but still $300 million is a ton of money spent in California to try to influence lawmaking. Here's by group about how much each industry spends trying to influence the government. Healthcare groups spend the most at around $35 million. You could probably guess why, right? I mean, essentially there's all these different healthcare groups competing for people to join their network. There's a ton of money to be had or lost. Education as well. Education, we have strong unions. We're constantly petitioning the government for more protections, better pay in some cases, better resources, which is tricky. I, of course, am biased here, so I won't say too much about it. The energy sector, also spends a lot of million, and the government sector, different government entities also lobby, spend about 35 million. So California has a ton of money going to Sacramento to influence how laws and policy are enacted. Okay, so that's going to do it for Lecture 7 Part B. Thank you for tuning in, and I will speak to you guys soon.